Hello, good evening, everyone. Ooh, it's a bit of a chilly one today, and it's just started raining, so I hope you're all snuggled up and ready for a story to get you in the mood for a good night's sleep. Our story tonight is one of my favourites. It's another Beatrix Potter, and it's called The Tale of Benjamin Bunny. And Beatrix Potter writes in the front of this book that this is for the children of Sawrey, from old Mr. Bunny. Sawrey was where Beatrix Potter used to live. One morning, a little rabbit sat on a bank. He pricked his ears and listened to the trot of a pony. A gig was coming along the road. It was driven by Mr. McGregor, and beside him sat Mrs. McGregor in her best bonnet. A gig is a sort of carriage that's pulled along by a horse. As soon as they had passed, little Benjamin Bunny slid down onto the road and set off with a hop, skip and a jump to call upon his relations who lived in the wood at the back of Mr. McGregor's garden. Can you remember who lives behind Mr. McGregor's garden? That wood was full of rabbit holes, and in the neatest, sandiest hole of them all lived Benjamin's aunt and his cousins, Flopsy, Mopsy, Cottontail, and Peter. Old Mrs. Rabbit was a widow. She earned her living by knitting rabbit wool mittens and muftis. I once bought a pair at a bazaar. She also sold herbs and rosemary tea, and rabbit tobacco, which is what we call lavender. Now, little Benjamin Bunny did not very much want to see his aunt. He came round the back of the fir tree and nearly tumbled upon the top of his cousin, Peter. Oh, Peter was sitting by himself. He looked poorly, and he was dressed in a red cotton handkerchief. "Peter," said little Benjamin in a whisper, "who's got your clothes?" I think it's Mr. McGregor, shall we say? Peter replied, "Oh, the scarecrow in Mr. McGregor's garden," and he described how he'd been chased about the garden and had dropped his coat and shoes. Little Benjamin sat down beside his cousin and assured him that Mr. McGregor had gone out in a gig, and Mrs. McGregor also, certainly for the day, because she was wearing her best bonnet. "Oh no, I hope they don't think they're going to go on the raid to Mrs. McGregor's garden." Peter said he hoped it would rain. At this point, old Mrs. Rabbit's voice was heard outside the rabbit hole calling, "Cottontail, Cottontail, fetch some chamomile." Peter said he thought he might feel better if he went for a walk. The two bunnies went hand in hand and got upon the flat top of the wall at the bottom of the wood. From there they looked down onto Mr. McGregor's garden. Peter's coat and shoes were very plainly to be seen upon the scarecrow, topped with an old tam-o'-shanter of Mr. McGregor's. Tam-o'-shanter's a sort of hat. Little Benjamin said, "It spoils people's clothes to squeeze under a gate. The proper way to get in is to climb down a pear tree." Peter fell down head first, but it was of no consequence, as the bed below was neatly raked and lovely and soft. "Oh no!" thought they might go hunting in Mr. McGregor's garden for the clothes. Oh, the ground had been sown with lettuces. They left a great many odd little footmarks all over the bed, especially little Benjamin, who was wearing clogs. Little Benjamin said that the first thing to be done was to get back Peter's clothes, in order that they might be able to use the pocket handkerchief. They took them off the scarecrow. There'd been rain during the night. There was water in the shoes, and the coat was somewhat shrunk. Benjamin tried on the tam-o'-shanter, but it was far too big for him. You've never seen a rabbit in a hat before? Then he suggested they should fill their pocket handkerchief with onions as a little present for his aunt. Peter did not seem to be enjoying himself. He kept hearing noises. "I I think he was very frightened last time, wasn't he, when he went in Mr. McGregor's garden? Benjamin, on the other hand, was perfectly at home, and he ate a lettuce leaf. He said that he was in the habit of coming to the garden with his father to get lettuces for their Sunday dinner. The name of little Benjamin's papa was old Mr. Benjamin Bunny. The lettuces certainly were very fine. They looked delicious. Peter did not eat anything. He said he should like to go home. Presently he dropped half the onions. Can you see they've fallen out of the handkerchief? Presently, Peter let go of the pocket handkerchief. There they are, all the onions falling all over the floor. They got amongst the flower pots and frames and tubs. Peter heard noises worse than ever. His eyes were as big as lollipops. He was a step or two in front of his cousin when he suddenly stopped. Oh no. This is what those little rabbits saw round that corner. Little Benjamin took one look, and then in half a minute, well, less than no time, he hid himself and Peter and the onions underneath a large basket. Can you see what it is? It's a cat. Guess what cats like to chase? Rabbits. The cat got up and stretched herself and came and sniffed at the basket. Perhaps she liked the smell of the onions. Anyway, she sat down upon the top of the basket. No, how will they escape? What a problem for the two little bunnies. She sat there for 5 hours. Now, I cannot draw you a picture of Peter and Benjamin underneath the basket because it was quite dark, and because of the smelling onions, which was fearful, it made little Peter Rabbit and little Benjamin Bunny cry. The sun got round behind the wood, and it was quite late in the afternoon, but still the cat sat on the basket. No. How will they escape? At length there was a pitter-patter, pitter-patter, and some tiny bits of mortar fell from the wall above. The cat looked up and saw old Mr. Benjamin Bunny prancing along the top of the wall of the upper terrace. He was smoking a pipe of rabbit tobacco and had a little switch in his hand. He was looking for his son, little Benjamin Bunny. Oh, do you think you'll find him? Old Mr. Bunny had no opinion whatsoever of cats. He took a tremendous jump off the wall onto the top of the cat and chuffed him off the basket and kicked it into the greenhouse, scratching off a handful of fur. The cat was much too surprised to scratch back. When old Mr. Bunny had driven the cat into the greenhouse, he locked the door. Then he came back to the basket and took out his son Benjamin by the ears and whipped him a little with the switch. Then he took out his nephew Peter, smacking his bottom. Then he took out the handkerchief of onions and he marched out of the garden. I think those rabbits have realised they've done the wrong thing. Well, when Mr. McGregor returned about half an hour later, he observed several things which puzzled him. It looked as though some person had been walking all over the garden in a pair of clogs. Only the footmarks were too ridiculously little. Also, he could not understand how the cat had managed to shut herself up inside the greenhouse, locking the door from the outside. When Peter got home, his mother forgave him, because she was so glad to see him, and so glad that he had found his shoes and coat. Cottontail and Peter folded up the pocket handkerchief, and old Mrs. Rabbit strung up the onions and hung them from the kitchen ceiling with the bunches of herbs and the rabbit tobacco. The end. Ooh, I don't think old Mr. Bunny was very happy with Benjamin, was he? But he shouldn't have been going in Mr. McGregor's garden because it's dangerous, isn't it, in there? Well, it's bedtime. I hope you have a lovely sleep. Get yourself all snuggled up because it's a bit of a chilly one tonight. And I will see you tomorrow. Good night.